There is a man you've crossed paths with, perhaps more than once. He has the voice of a dreamer, the curiosity of youth, and a certain glow that draws people close. He speaks of what he could become, where he might go, and the things he was surely meant to do. But time passes and nothing solid ever forms. He's caught in a strange pause, not fully broken but never built. There's movement, yet no direction. He's not idle, but he's not arriving anywhere either. He is not just a V. Avoiding responsibility. He is avoiding becoming. Beneath his surface lies not laziness, but something far more subtle, a psychological resistance to growing into the shape of a man. And this isn't about age. It's about orientation, not of the body, but of the soul. Carl Jung called this pattern Puer Aeternus, the eternal boy, a figure trapped in potential, allergic to limitation, and often celebrated for qualities that, left unchecked, eventually erode his own life. This pattern does not wear a name tag. It hides behind charm, wit, or ambition. It can look like genius or seem like freedom. But behind the enchantment, there's always one missing thing: form. What begins as possibility slowly turns into avoidance, and if left unchallenged, the man drifts further from the ground he was meant to stand on. This is not a critique. It is a quiet unveiling. If you recognize this in someone close, or perhaps more painfully in yourself, then what follows is not judgment, but an invitation, one that calls you to look past the surface and into the roots of what it truly means to grow. One, when potential becomes a trap. At first glance, he seems full of promise. His words are captivating, his ideas wide in scope, his energy boundless. He dreams in vivid detail, paints a future filled with triumph, meaning, and grandeur. But as time goes on, the canvas remains empty. Nothing materializes. Projects begin but never finish. Relationships spark but fail to take root. The man who once appeared destined for greatness seems permanently stalled at the starting line. This is where potential becomes a prison. The very thing that once inspired now constrains. For the Puer Aeternus, possibility is more comforting than action. Starting something means risking failure. Committing means limitations. And so he remains in the safety of becoming, not because he lacks the tools, but because the thought of confronting his inadequacies terrifies him. He is more afraid of being ordinary than he is of doing nothing. The eternal boy lives in the future tense. He sighs one day often. He lives for inspiration and withers in routine. He seeks magic, not momentum. And in this search for the extraordinary, he forfeits the achievable. Reality cannot compete with the perfection of fantasy. But in trying to preserve this illusion, he abandons his power to change the world in any meaningful way. The tragedy is not in what he fails to do, but in how his unfulfilled potential begins to define him. It corrodes his self-worth, strains his relationships, and leaves him isolated. The longer he waits, the heavier his inaction becomes, and soon the man who once promised the world cannot even show up for himself. Worse still, the more he identifies with potential, the more fragile he becomes. He cannot tolerate criticism because it challenges the ideal. He avoids commitment, fearing it will box him in. He surrounds himself with enablers who validate his illusions rather than those who hold up a mirror. This isolation, though self-chosen, becomes suffocating. And then there is the silent guilt. He knows deep down that time is passing, that opportunities are slipping away, that his potential, if left untouched, will curdle into regret. But the shame of falling short only deepens the paralysis, so he doubles down on dreaming, hoping that the next idea, the next spark, will finally be enough to justify all the waiting. But it never is, because the only thing that transforms potential into reality is action. And until he chooses to act, not perfectly but persistently, He will remain suspended in the tragic comfort of what might have been. 2. Freedom as a disguise. He calls it freedom, the choice to walk away, the refusal to be pinned down, the avoidance of schedules, labels, or expectations. To him, freedom is sacred. But underneath this insistence on openness lies a deeper fear, the fear of being seen as lacking. The man-child often resists the structures that adult life demands. He views jobs as cages, relationships as traps, and responsibility as a threat to his sense of self. What he fails to recognize is that structure doesn't restrict freedom, it enables it. Without a framework, freedom is directionless. It becomes noise instead of music. In truth, his freedom is rarely an active choice. It's a passive avoidance. It gives him an exit from difficulty, a loophole from accountability. He isn't rejecting the world because he has mastered himself. He's rejecting it because he does not trust himself to endure it. He calls this strength, but it's simply fear dressed in new clothes. True freedom is not found in evading responsibility, but in choosing it. It's in knowing where your energy belongs and investing it, even when doubt looms. The eternal boy wants love without compromise, success without structure, identity without effort. And in refusing to sacrifice anything, he ends up with nothing that lasts. This illusion of freedom ultimately limits him. He becomes unreliable, drifting, and increasingly difficult to engage with. The world around him moves on, while he remains suspended in potential, convinced that he is protecting something pure, when in fact he is simply afraid to fail. Freedom in its most authentic form is a discipline. It is built through boundaries, through sacrifice, through repetition. It is not found in the denial of structure, but in its wise navigation. The man-child rejects all rules, unaware that a life without chosen constraints quickly collapses under its own chaos. The constant escape eventually leads him to nothing, but fatigue. Ironically, he begins to feel trapped by his own so-called freedom. He experiences an odd mix of restlessness and stagnation. Nothing excites him anymore because everything remains unresolved. Opportunities start to feel like burdens. The open road becomes a loop. And slowly he loses faith in the very ideals he once clung to. People around him sense it. They notice how quickly he disengages, how allergic he is to permanence. Friends stop inviting him to collaborate. Lovers stop planning futures with him. Employers give up. Not because he is incapable, but because he never stays. His freedom has become a story only he believes in. And yet this crisis is not without hope. It is the cracking of the illusion. The recognition that freedom without grounding is emptiness. That to be free one must choose, and then honor that choice long after it has lost its shine. The boy must learn that constraints are not enemies, but gateways. That without a foundation, flight becomes fall. If he dares to surrender the myth, he might discover a truth far greater than freedom. The strength to commit, the courage to endure, and the wisdom to build a life that holds real weight. 3. The damage he leaves behind. In the early days, he is electric. He breathes life into a room, radiates excitement, and inspires dreams. But slowly, the enchantment thins, the inconsistency grows, promises are made and broken, projects collapse. He disappears emotionally, sometimes physically, and those who once believed in him begin to feel the slow sting of disappointment. The man-child rarely means harm. His detachment isn't malicious, but that does not make the impact any less painful. Romantic partners feel abandoned, as if they're holding a relationship alone. Friends tire of lifting a man who will not walk. Family watches potential decay with quiet heartbreak. What makes it more confusing is his language. He often speaks in metaphors, talks of alignment, of needing space, of searching for clarity. But this is not clarity, it is evasion. And the people around him slowly begin to realize that his absence is not a temporary storm, but a pattern. Thus, two who try to help him are left drained. They feel used, even if he never intended it. They're drawn in by the possibility of who he could be, but slowly wake up to the weight of who he refuses to become. The damage builds quietly, like erosion. Small missed calls, unpaid bills, broken trust. It doesn't erupt, it accumulates. And through it all, he keeps telling himself the same story, that the world just doesn't understand him, that others expect too much, that he just needs more. Time, but it's not time he lacks, it's willingness. And in his refusal to confront himself, he leaves a wake of small, private heartbreaks that others must clean up without him. This erosion is most devastating in love. In the beginning, he makes you feel seen, perhaps even chosen. He speaks of visions, of shared futures, of a love unlike any other. But he cannot sustain the intimacy he initiates. He wants to be adored, not known. He craves companionship, but rejects accountability. The deeper the relationship moves, the more he begins to withdraw. Sometimes subtly, sometimes overnight. Friends grow weary too. They want to believe he'll change, that the next time will be different. But the cycle remains unchanged. Excitement, retreat, apology, reset. His sincerity makes it harder to walk away. He means what he says, in the moment, but he does not follow through. They begin to mourn someone still alive, a slow grieving of consistency that never arrives. In professional life, the damage looks different but echoes the same theme. He may impress during interviews, charm his way into opportunities, even begin projects with fervor. But deadlines slip, details are forgotten, teamwork becomes difficult, and eventually the enthusiasm he brought becomes a liability, not because he lacks skill, but because no one can rely on him. Even those who love him the most begin to set boundaries, not because they are cruel, but because their stability demands it. They realize that carrying his potential is not their responsibility, that being available for him means being unavailable for themselves. Perhaps the cruelest part of this damage is its invisibility. It doesn't show up in headlines. It doesn't scream. It whispers, accumulates, and then breaks. And by the time the man-child notices, the trust is gone, the door is closed, and he is left wondering why no one stays. 4. The shadow that haunts him. Carl Jung wrote that the shadow is the part of ourselves we do not wish to see. For the Puer Aeternus, that shadow is the adult he refuses to become. He idealizes creativity, fluidity, spontaneity. But adulthood requires groundedness, sacrifice, and responsibility, and those he buries deep. When these qualities emerge, he flinches. He labels them as boring, conventional, soul-killing. But it isn't the qualities themselves he fears, it is what they ask of him. They demand effort without immediate reward. They require that he stand still long enough to see where he really is. The shadow doesn't stay hidden forever. Over time, it leaks out, in anger, in anxiety, in subtle sabotage. He may lash out at authority, withdraw from intimacy, or seek validation through self-destructive habits. These are not acts of rebellion. They are signs of fracture. His unconscious is tired of pretending, and the deeper the denial, the more the shadow controls him. He becomes reactive, brittle, defensive. He blames others, fearing that admitting weakness would destroy his carefully crafted image. But strength does not come from avoidance. It comes from integrating the parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. Until he is willing to sit with his fear, acknowledge his shortcomings, and forgive his immaturity, the shadow will haunt him. It will whisper doubt in moments of hope, collapse joy with sudden dread. It will be his constant companion, not because it wishes to destroy him, but because it is begging to be seen. The man-child resists stillness. He fills his life with motion, distraction, and noise, anything to avoid hearing the truth beneath it all. He fears silence because silence reflects. He fears roots because roots imply permanence. But most of all, he fears the ordinary. To him, growing up feels like surrender. But in truth, it's a claim to authenticity. He confuses resistance with rebellion. He thinks that in opposing structure, he is protecting freedom. But what he's really protecting is a fragile sense of identity, one that cannot withstand the scrutiny of adult life. In moments of crisis, this identity begins to crack, and if he does not face it, it collapses entirely. Jung reminds us that the shadow holds not just what we fear, but also what we lack. The strength we need is often buried under the mask we wear. To integrate the shadow is not to destroy the boy, but to bring him home. To show him that maturity doesn't mean the death of wonder, only the birth of substance. And in this reckoning, something changes. When he finally stops running, when he looks in the mirror without defense, the shadow softens. It ceases to haunt and begins to guide, not as a tyrant, but as a teacher. The boy within him does not vanish, he evolves, and so does the man. 5. The seduction of the maternal. The eternal boy often walks with a shadow not only behind him, but beside him. The archetypal mother, sometimes literal, more often symbolic. She nurtures, supports, and softens the edges of his fear. But beneath that comfort is a quiet contract. You remain small, and I will keep you safe. Carl Jung spoke of the devouring mother, not one who intends harm, but one who refuses to let the child become separate. Her care becomes control, her warmth a barrier. And the man-child, shaped by this dynamic, unconsciously seeks it out in other women. Partners who rescue, who accommodate, who parent rather than partner. He doesn't crave companionship, he craves containment. A woman who won't challenge him. A lover who soothes, not strengthens. He wants her to carry his emotions, manage his needs, and offer unconditional acceptance, all while demanding little in return. This dynamic creates an imbalance so subtle that even the woman involved may not notice it at first. She feels needed, chosen, even essential. But as time goes on, the relationship begins to feel heavy. She is doing the emotional labor for two. Her own needs are sidelined, her voice dims. And the man-child, he believes this is love, but it isn't. It's dependency. He confuses being held with being loved, and when the partner finally asks for reciprocity, for accountability, for presence, for adulthood, he pulls away. Not out of cruelty, but because the illusion has cracked. The maternal figure, whether real or symbolic, becomes the reason he never confronts himself. As long as someone is softening the world for him, he has no incentive to grow. The pain is postponed, but not preve. Aunt Ted. The mother protects, but she also imprisons. And when she finally withdraws, either by setting boundaries or by leaving, he experiences it not as growth, but as betrayal. He mourns not the woman, but the safety, not the relationship, but the refuge. And in that mourning, he has a choice: collapse further into victimhood or rise toward integration. True partnership is not built on rescue. It is forged through mutual recognition. When the eternal boy stops seeking a mother, or in his lover, he begins to see her as an equal. And that is where real love begins, not in dependence, but in shared strength. 6. The grief of growing up. There is a moment when illusions begin to rot, not suddenly, but quietly. The dreams that once filled his chest with fire now feel heavy. The endless tomorrows he once chased begin to feel like a trap. Time, which once seemed infinite, begins to echo, and the eternal boy stands at the edge of something terrifying, the edge of becoming. Growing up is not a single act. It is a shedding, a slow erosion of fantasy, a painful acknowledgement that the world due is not bend for our comfort, that life in all its harshness waits for no one. The grief of growing up is not about loss of youth, it is about the death of illusions we once mistook for identity. Carl Jung referred to this as a psychic death, a symbolic breakdown of the false self to allow the emergence of the true. But this process is brutal. It requires mourning the boy who once believed the world owed him something. It demands a confrontation with every lie we told to postpone responsibility. And it asks us to stand, naked and uncertain, in front of the very life we once avoided. For the man-child, this grief often comes disguised. It may arrive as burnout, as depression, as a failed relationship or a missed opportunity that finally pierces through his excuses. He doesn't always know he is grieving. He just feels tired, lost, fractured. But underneath that weariness is a sacred fire, the beginning of transformation. This stage is often lonely. People who owe to see, admired his spontaneity, now avoid his instability. The mothering figures retreat, the rescuers walk away, and what remains is silence, a silence that asks, now what? And here lies the threshold. Many turn back. They reinvent old dreams, make new excuses, and try once again to escape the discomfort of change. But those who choose to stay, to feel it, to face it, begin to understand a deeper truth, that growing up is not a betrayal of who we were, but a homecoming to who we are. It is not the extinguishing of creativity, but the anchoring of it. It is not the death of freedom, but its redefinition. Real freedom is not absence of limits. It is conscious discipline. It is the ability to act, even when inspiration is gone. It is the courage to love again, even after disappointment. It is the willingness to show up, not perfectly, but consistently. And it hurts. There is no escape from that. To grow is to lose. To gain wisdom is to bury versions of ourselves we once adored. To become real is to watch the fantasy die. But in that death, something extraordinary is born. Integrity, solidity, the man. He is not louder than the boy. He is not flashier, but he is present, grounded, capable. And slowly the world begins to respond differently. Doors open that once remained shut. Trust is rebuilt, love deepens, and the man who once floated through life begins finally to build. 7. From escapist to creator. When the fantasy finally fades, something new begins to stir. A quiet recognition, a hum of responsibility that doesn't feel like a burden, but a call. The boy, once obsessed with potential, begins to glimpse the beauty of action. Not grand gestures, not public triumphs, but small daily acts of building something real. The transition from escapist to creator doesn't happen overnight. It is not a burst of motivation. It is a disciplined reorientation. It is the moment he stops waiting to feel ready and starts choosing to begin. This man no longer views structure as confinement. He sees it as a container for power. He understands that focus multiplies energy, that repetition breeds mastery. He no longer flinches at discomfort. He walks into it, knowing it is the price of momentum. The creator is not perfect. He stumbles, he doubts, but he returns. He returns to the work, to the relationship, to the vision. He understands now that consistency is not boring. It is sacred. That what he builds slowly will outlast what he chased in haste. The eternal boy wanted applause. The man wants legacy. The boy wanted magic. The man makes meaning. And in this shift, something profound happens. He begins to trust himself. Trust is not a gift. It is earned, action by action. It is forged in quiet mornings, in kept promises, in work done when no one is watching. As this trust builds, so does his identity. He no longer needs to prove, he only needs to do. The creator becomes a quiet force. He doesn't explain himself. He doesn't chase validation. He listens more. He refines. He becomes a man who can be counted on, not because he claims he can, but because he shows up again and again, regardless of mood, fear, or praise. And here the boy finds his place, not exiled, but integrated. His dreams are no longer distractions. They are raw material. His spontaneity becomes innovation. His ination fuels action. The very traits that once made him fragile now serve a mature purpose. This integration is the reward of the journey. The creator is not at war with his younger self. He has simply stopped letting him drive. He leads now, not with fantasy, but with focus. Not with excuses, but with effort. Not with escape, but with creation. And in doing so, he becomes a man not only free, but dangerous, in the best way. Dangerous to despair, to mediocrity, to the part of himself that once settled for drifting. He no longer waits for permission, he builds, and what he builds becomes his proof that he was never meant to remain a boy. He was meant to become the man who could carry him forward. There comes a point where pretending becomes heavier than reality. The mask begins to slip, not from exhaustion, but from truth pushing through. The stories we told to protect ourselves start to wear thin, and the world, once tolerable in our delay, begins to demand something more. Not brilliance, not promise, but presence. The boy within us doesn't vanish with time. He lingers in the choices we delay, the responsibilities we defer, the discomforts we excuse. And if we are not what? He begins to lead, not through malice, but through fear. Fear of becoming ordinary, of being judged, of being seen for what we really are, unfinished, uncertain, and human. But the man emerges not by banishing the boy, but by placing him in the right seat. When desire is tempered by direction, when chaos is met with structure, when fear is named rather than obeyed, something shifts. Maturity is not an event. It's a pattern of brave decisions repeated quietly. Jung warned that what we do not face inside will return to us outside, disguised as fate. The man-child is not just a phase. He is a mirror, one that asks whether we will keep circling the edges of ourselves or step through into the discomfort of substance. No one is ever truly ready to grow up. But there comes a moment when not growing costs more than the risk of stepping forward. When that moment comes, all that remains is to decide, not perfectly, not permanently, just honestly that finally it is time to begin.